Hi guys, today we start the fourth chapter of the book India That Is Bharat by J. Deepak, and it's called Entrenchment of Coloniality Through European Political Structures. Based on the discussion undertaken thus far on the nature and origins of European coloniality, it is possible to reasonably posit the following. 1. The European colonial project, which started with Columbus's expedition in 1492, did indeed have a clear Christian inspiration that viewed nature as well as the non-Christian New World through its Cartesian dualist or humanist prism. And 2. This dualist approach gave birth to the European colonizers' sense of superiority over the rest of nature, including non-Christian idolatrous and nature-worshipping indigenous peoples. It led to the reshaping of nature to suit the material goals of the European colonizer, thereby giving rise to modern notions of development, and his sense of anthropological superiority created a race consciousness that spawned the global imperial exercise to civilize their soulless heathen natives by replacing the entirety of their cultures with the Europeans. The cumulative effect was a colonial remapping of geographies and boundaries and a distinctly religion-inspired, race-driven reallocation of labor and resources, culminating in the creation of the modern economy as well as its political institutions. Naturally, the political, religious, legal and educational infrastructure set up by the colonizer was geared towards meeting the end goals of the said global project. However, the extent of investment and settlement in indigenous lands by the European colonizer depended on the opportunity they represented and their hospitality, both physical and social. According to Patrick Ziltner, where conditions were conducive for settlement, including for political consolidation, it led to settler colonialism, and therefore greater institutional investment in the colonized society. For instance, after setting up the administrative and legal apparatus, which ensured that the reins of the colonized society were firmly in the hands of the colonizer, educational institutions were established primarily in those colonies where the colonizers settled. In contrast, in those lands which were not conducive for settlement but were rich in resources, institutions that facilitated the process of rent-seeking and expropriation of resources through the purchased or coerced aid of local rulers were set up. Importantly, the manner in which natives were recruited into the colonial power structure was yet another proof of the European colonizers' deeply ingrained ethno-religious consciousness. Soldiers and mercenaries were recruited from those sections of the native society that were identified as martial races, which was developed into a full-fledged doctrine and also applied in India. The British Indian Army was organized on religious and caste lines, again pointing to the colonizers' racial approach not just to religion but also to caste. The after effects of such an approach to indigenous social structures are being felt even today in our understanding of the idea of caste and the way it has been portrayed in India studies within the way it has been portrayed in India studies within Bharat and the rest of the world. India studies is a different discipline of education and academics. A similar approach, also known as Indology probably, it's close related if not exactly the same. A similar approach to army recruitment based on ethnicity was employed in British Borneo, Burma, and the British areas of Africa. The Dutch were no different in their recruitment strategies in the Dutch East Indies. Apart from the army, this policy of recruitment was extended to civil services as well as wherein native elites who had bought into the idea of the European way being the pinnacle of civilization were given preferential access to European education so that they could occupy posts of prestige in the colonial administrative structure. Those that converted to Christianity clearly enjoyed greater representation in the colonial administration, such as in the case of the Christian Sinhalese in British Ceylon. Further, communities and groups were pitted against one another through preferential treatment, which created animosities. Similarly, on the economic front, stereotypes relating to occupational specializations were reinforced and made further rigid through colonial policies, thereby interfering with the organic flow of the native society's socio-cultural dynamics. The political structure established by the Christian European colonizer in the colonies not only furthered the goal of economic exploitation, but also served to consciously keep the native society in a constantly fragmented state while consolidating the Europeans' political and territorial hold over it. This strategy ensured that for a long time, native voices would not unite to oppose the colonizers' presence, instead, as they don't even do today. This strategy ensured that for a long time, native voices would not unite to oppose the colonizers' presence. Instead, they would entirely depend on the colonizer, his ideas, and his institutions for continuity of life. The extent of dependence was evidenced by the fact that even the native elites, or perhaps especially the elites, began to subscribe to the colonizer's view that the native society would fall into disarray and utter confusion if the colonizer was to pack his bags and leave. In the mind of the native, the success of the colonizer in keeping the native society under his thumb was attributed to his overall cultural superiority, race included, and specifically to the most visible aspect of the colonial apparatus, namely the administrative and legal systems imposed on the colonized societies. Naturally, the political and legal theories underlying the edifice found significant purchase among native elites thanks to their participation in the colonial administration as well as through colonial education, both of which covered the praxis and theory of colonial political thought. It needs to be appreciated that by the mid-19th century, thanks to the continued global presence of the colonizer for over a century, the Christian European vision for civilizing the rest of the world had been significantly secularized and universalized, unconsciously and otherwise. This meant that colonized societies that looked up to the edifice of the colonizer were no more alive, if they ever were, to the Christian ontoepistem that informed the colonial worldview. Consequently, the premises and pillars of the colonial political, administrative and legal ecosystems were accepted as universal norm by the native elites. Critically, European ideas and institutions were deemed to be equally valid for a decolonized future that was independent of the colonizer, and this independence too was defined in European terms. An independent nation-state, modeled on European lines, was the decolonized future towards which native aspirations were generally oriented. It is in this context that it becomes imperative to understand some of the key ideas and their entirely unsecular origins that informed the colonial political structure. The objective of this decolonial exercise is to be able to understand the impact that these ideas, including secularism and constitutionalism, had on freedom movements in colonized societies and their culmination in the creation of nation-states built on the colonial legacy. One might ask, so what if the political edifice of the European colonizer was informed by a non-secular and patently religious framework if ultimately it has been secularized? Why obsess over the colonizer's religion? Such a question misses the entire point of the analysis, namely to identify the theological foundations of the colonial infrastructure, since it has no legs to stand on independent of them. And therefore, their identification is necessary to outline and define a decolonial approach. In this regard, based on my reading of Dr. Jacob D. Roover's work on the history of secularism, it needs to be underscored that the secularization of the Christian ontoepistem is the consequence of obscuring the source of a certain thought and focusing exclusively on its outward expression. This outward expression must be examined for its undergirding because those who do not subscribe to that OET, which is the fount of the particular thought, have the right to know of its origins and reject its imposition. This would be consistent with the right of every society to wish to be governed by its own values, which are derived from its own culture. Only after being apprised of its source, it is for the society to decide whether to embrace a thought notwithstanding its foreign theological inspiration. In other words, the society has the right to prior informed consent before the imposition of an alien principle. To pixelate and deny the origins of a thought, in my view, is plain deception. This argument acquires greater validity and legitimacy in the context of imposition of the colonizer's politico-economic worldview on dominated societies, where the power balance was obviously skewed in favor of the colonizer and remained so for centuries. Therefore, an examination of such worldview through the prism of coloniality necessarily requires us to question whether a specific foreign theological framework was at play, notwithstanding all the attempts at secularizing and universalizing it, because universalization of a particular way of life was the very object of coloniality. Simply put, despite the discomfort such examination is bound to cause, which too is attributable to ingrained coloniality, it is indispensable and inevitable if indigenous societies are to claim and to reclaim their right to agency at the most fundamental level.